Joining me down the line is Conservative MP and the former chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood. And over to discuss this is former British Army Commander Colonel Richard Kemp, who's over in Israel. Richard and Tobias, welcome both of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Richard, let me just ask you first, the move by Israel to go after a Hezbollah leader in Lebanon, was that something that might have happened anyway, or was that seen as a sort of a retaliation, if you like, to what happened over the weekend?
Well, Israel's taken out quite a few Hezbollah and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders in Lebanon since Hezbollah started firing missiles daily at Israel immediately after the 7th of October. So it may well have happened anyway, I don't know. But one thing we should bear in mind is that prior to carrying out, or maybe concurrently with carrying out, a retaliatory attack against Iran, Israel has to bear in mind that there are 150,000 missiles with Lebanese Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy, pointing at Israel with the explicit purpose of deterring Israel from attacking or retaliating if Israel attacks. So somehow they've got to balance a retaliation against Iran, which is absolutely essential after Iran launches attack on Israel, with being able to contain potentially a massive missile onslaught from Lebanon, from Hezbollah.
Yes. Tobias, let me come to you. Rishi Sunak says he doesn't want to prescribe the Islamic Revolutionary Guard because at the moment he prefers to be sort of inside the tent, if you like, with an embassy in Tehran where we can influence what they do. Is that a bit of a naive way to look at the world?
Well, I firstly agree with Colonel Richard there. He has a better understanding of what's going on the ground. Massive pressure on Israel to respond. Any country would want to respond if they had a salvo of over 300 drones, missiles heading your way. What happens next is so critical. This wider picture of the influence of the IRGC is absolutely important. It's the bigger question that perhaps we've been avoiding for a couple of decades. It's through the IRGC and the Quds Force in particular that Iran is able to use its proxy influence in places like Gaza, in Lebanon, and indeed in Yemen as well. If one thing comes from all this, there must be a grander strategy to not only curtail Iran's ability to attack Israel directly, but also to reduce, to diminish the capability of these proxy organizations. As Colonel Richard was just alluding to there, Hezbollah is the most powerful non-state actor in the world. How did we allow that to get into that place where it has so much dominance, not just in Lebanon, but also in neighboring Syria as well? These are the bigger questions that need to be addressed, but also not losing sight of the fact there's still an ongoing conflict in Gaza in dealing with Hamas, in making sure we get humanitarian aid in, and indeed the hostages out. Very complicated indeed. And the last thing that the West wants to see Israel do is to respond in a way that's likely to conflate matters rather than take us into a strategic direction of travel.
Yes. And Richard, I know that you've been one of those, I think, who has advocated a big response rather than a small response. And I was somewhat in agreement with you as well, given that Israel is under bombardment and has been under bombardment from rockets from Hezbollah and from Hamas for years on a daily basis. And, you know, Hezbollah has effectively taken over the government in Lebanon and is now basically a rogue state. I think we've just lost Richard for a moment. So, Tobias, let me continue on with you. You know, Lebanon is basically a rogue state. You know, it had that terrible explosion a few years ago, which turned out to be something that was due to the negligence of the way the government is run. It's pretty much a bankrupt nation. The people are starving in large part. There's no water in many parts of the country. And yet, you know, Iran continues to bankroll the terrorist part of that failed state.
Yeah, it's exactly the challenge that we've had over the last 3 decades, I think, where we've become increasingly risk averse to stand up to instability, where we see it and catch it before it gets too large. And that is the challenge that we face now, is what do we do? There needs to be a strategy that deals with this.
It really does. And I was listening to some military advisors earlier on today, Tobias, talking about the attack and the nature of the attack on Israel at the weekend by a series of hundreds of drones followed by ballistic missiles. And I'm told that it was very much a Russian model that the Russians have used these tactics against Ukraine, where they'll send in an awful lot of drones to confuse the sort of the air defences in order to then send the missiles in afterwards. And it just so happened that Israel's defences were so good that nothing really got through. But if the same attack was launched on Britain, for example, most of those missiles would get through.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think one of the big questions that came up in Parliament is, do we have the capability in the UK to have that sense of protection that Iron Dome provides? And that is something that we do need to look at in the UK. The utility of drones was an indication of where the character of conflict is going. And we need to recognize that and upgrade our defense posture to cater for that. We perhaps dismiss the scale of this attack because the Iron Dome system is arguably the best in the world, the best defense missile system in the world. That should not dismiss the fact that this was wrong. This was unprecedented state-on-state aggression from Iran.
Yes, indeed. I think we've got Colonel Richard Kemp back. Richard, I understand that Rishi Sunak wanted to make a phone call to Benjamin Netanyahu this afternoon. I'm not sure if it happened. Don't think it did, because we're told that Mr. Netanyahu's not that interested in talking to world leaders who want to tell him to take it easy and take the win.
I think the idea that Israel should somehow take this as a win when it's had, and I think the real figure is actually closer to 450 missiles fired at it, given that quite a large number of them have crashed between launch and arriving anywhere near Israel's airspace, or indeed crashed on launch. So, 450 missiles, yes, there was a tremendous success, and that tremendous success was due both to Israel's multi-layered missile defense system and its allies. And it was, I think, as a British person, former British soldier, I was very, very proud to see the Royal Air Force flying in defense of Israel, as I hate to say anything good about the French, but the French were as well. And indeed, several Arab countries helped Israel defend itself. But it's not a win. It's the win. The win will come when Israel retaliates, and Israel must retaliate. We shouldn't forget, whatever we may think personally, in this region, there's only one language that's understood, and that's the language of strength. Israel has to respond disproportionately. It has to deliver a far greater response than it received from Iran. If it doesn't do that, we will be into a tit-for-tat round of, retaliation and a cycle of missile attacks going both ways. We don't want to have that. We want a sufficient punishment of Iran to understand that it can't keep doing this. And I think any world leader who advises Prime Minister Netanyahu not to retaliate should actually examine, in his mind, what he would do if his own country came under this sort of attack. And I think we all know what would happen. We know what happened when Britain came under V-1 rocket attacks in 1944. We responded with devastating firepower against rocket launch sites, rocket manufacturing sites. We fired at railway lines that we used to send the rockets, and anything else to do with that infrastructure. And of course, we should encourage Israel to do the same thing in response to Iran, not forgetting that Iran is on the verge of becoming a nuclear-armed state. And the next time they launch missiles at Israel, one of them or more of them could have nuclear warheads on board. Yeah.
Tobias, let me ask you why you think David Cameron and Rishi Sunak both would disagree with what Richard Kemp just said. They think that he should take the win, he should show restraint. I mean, it's a strange attitude for an ally of Israel to take, isn't it?
I understand why you use those words. Actually, I think it was President Biden that used those words, not the Prime Minister. I think David Cameron was looking for strategic patience. There's no doubt there needs to be some form of response. You cannot let this go. I'd absolutely agree with that premise. I simply say that there was huge global sympathy after those barbaric attacks on the 7th of October by Hamas. But the consequences of not having a strategy when Israel then retaliated, causing a lot of collateral damage, infrastructure, the prospect of famine, not getting the hostages back, actually acting as a recruitment sergeant for Hamas, no clarity getting towards a two-state solution, and then losing a lot of international will. There's an understanding desire for revenge, and certainly no doubt pressure, which Colonel Richard will be able to, I'm sure, confirm in Israel from the domestic audience there, from the public, to say, let's do something. But you need to think carefully about what that something is. It must lead, as I say, into a wider strategy that is able to contain Iran and break the umbilical cords that it has with Hamas, with Hezbollah, and with, of course, with the Houthis in Yemen.
Yep. There are many, of course, who say that it's the appeasement of Iran that's led us to exactly where we are now. But we haven't got many time to develop that, I'm afraid. But thank you, Tobias. Thank you, Colonel Richard Kemp, as well.